Welcome back. It's Danny Haiphong, and you are tuning in to a reading of one of my published articles, this time in my own Substack at chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com, published on February 8th and then republished in Black Agenda Report February 9th. This one is on Eileen Gu, who has received such a racist backlash from every orifice of the US-led new Cold War apparatus that I felt it was necessary to respond, as I have a personal connection to the backlash that Eileen Gu has received. So let's get into the article. It's titled "The Eileen Gu Controversy Exposes the Importance of Racial Loyalty to the American Empire." The young skier has become the target of a racist backlash, as I said, that oozes from every orifice of the US-led new Cold War apparatus. So Eileen Gu, she is a world-class skier who has already won her first gold medal in the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics at the age of 18. Gu was raised in San Francisco by a mixed-race family. Her mom, who she posts about often on social media, is Chinese. In 2019, Gu announced that she planned to represent the Chinese national team for the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympic Games. But it has only been within the last few weeks, as the Winter Olympics prepared to launch, that her decision began to stir a considerable amount of controversy. Gu has been labeled an ungrateful traitor to the United States and has supposedly spurned the opportunities offered to her in the land of the free. The vitriol directed at Gu has come from all corners of U.S. society. Former Olympic skier Jen Hudak told the media that, quote, "Gu became the athlete she is because she grew up in the United States, where she had access to premier training grounds and coaching that as a female she might not have had in China," end quote. Popular right-wing show host Tucker Carlson claimed that Gu renounced her citizenship and betrayed her own country by choosing to ski for China. A report in The Economist framed Gu's decision as an agonizing moment for the teenage phenom, who finds herself split between two countries engaged in superpower rivalry. No evidence for this claim, as it personally related to Gu, was provided in the article. Corporate media commentary has repeatedly emphasized that Gu was born in the USA, to quote Bruce Springsteen, while social media users on the far right have openly called for the Olympic skier to leave the country for her act of betrayal. The intense reaction to Gu comes amid a tireless U.S. effort to delegitimize China in the lead up to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. U.S. President Joe Biden announced a diplomatic boycott of the Games last December, a relatively meaningless gesture that has already seen more than a dozen State Department officials apply for visas to travel to the Games shortly after the policy supposedly went into effect. A nonstop propaganda blitz has helped pass legislation like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act a few weeks later. The bill effectively sanctions U.S. corporations from doing business in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region by requiring proof that products imported from the region are not made from Uyghur forced labor. These policy moves just skim the surface of the U.S.-led new Cold War on China and its many forms of aggression in the military, diplomatic, economic, and information realms. As I penned in a previous column on casual racism in the new Cold War, fear is a critical component of the U.S.'s racist and imperialist attacks on China. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi summed up modern American fear of China when she warned that U.S. athletes on the day of the opening ceremony not to speak out against China for fear that its ruthless government would seek reprisal. Pelosi's characterization of China fits one side of casual racism's double-edged sword. Fear of China's supposedly unmatched ruthlessness is complemented by a ceaseless suspicion of China's COVID-19 response, poverty alleviation program, and overall political and economic stability. China is all-powerful, yet never successful, a menace to the free world, but on a never-ending road to collapse. The U.S.-led new Cold War is an imperialist project, plain and simple. At its core is a ceaseless effort to undermine and eventually overthrow China's socialist and economic political system. More visible to the naked eye is the palpable fear expressed by Western capitalists that China's economy will surpass the U.S. in GDP terms over the next half-decade. War profiteers have also benefited immensely from the new Cold War. The U.S. military budget continues to grow, with special funds set aside for countering the so-called China threat. Of course, the new Cold War is also a reflection of a long history of imperialist aggression dating back to the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century. The Opium Wars carved up China and left the nation weak and impoverished. Western imperialists justified plunging China into what the Chinese call a century of humiliation with yellow peril racism. The Chinese were routinely dehumanized and portrayed in Western media as sneaky thieves and racists who were deserved to be deported or worse. Yellow peril justified the racist immigration laws that were passed in that period, which increased the rate of exploitation of and violently managed the flow of surplus labor migrating from China. China and Chinese people were only useful to the West then, so long as they were weak and subservient. This all changed after the Chinese Revolution of 1949 sent shock waves through the Western capitalist world. U.S. officials lamented over losing China to communism and placed the newly socialist nation under sanctions from 1949 to 1971, and, not to mention, threatened nuclear war on China more than once over that same period. However, Cold War imperialist aggression has been unsuccessful in destabilizing China. To paraphrase Mao Zedong, the Chinese people stood up in 1949 and are continuing to show no signs of sitting back down to their former oppressors. China's achievements in poverty alleviation, public health, high technology, renewable energy, and a myriad of other fields have changed the course of history. A multipolar world is emerging where non-white, formerly colonized nations assert their self-determination in the midst of a declining imperialist order. China is leading the way. Racial loyalty is an expression of both unconscious and conscious resentment toward these developments and plays a central role in the anger over Gu's decision to represent China. To many in the U.S., Gu has chosen the side of the quote-unquote savages and the wretched of the earth. She has rejected the United States as her white motherland, and the overarching perception is that the U.S.'s superiority is as inherent as China's supposed inferiority. This makes Gu's decision a clear pledge of loyalty to a country of 1.4 billion non-white people and 90-plus million members of the Communist Party of China. In the eyes of her detractors, then, Eileen Gu is not just an ungrateful immigrant, but an assault on American exceptionalism itself. Such a view is entirely irrational once the blinders of racism are taken off. Gu is deeply connected to China on a personal and professional level. She is fluent in Mandarin and spends most summers in Beijing pre-pandemic visiting loved ones. Gu is a Chinese citizen and has several Chinese sponsors, while her mother works for a Chinese investment firm. In addition to her connections to China, it is obvious that Gu is developing a moral compass of her own and views her actions as bigger than herself. She is an outspoken advocate on issues of anti-Asian racism and gender equality. In her Instagram post announcing the decision to ski for China, Gu informed her audience that she hopes to, through her decision, quote, unite people, promote common understanding, create communication, and forge friendships among nations, end quote. This is a powerful message that demonstrates that Gu is less interested in geopolitics as she is about using her platform to promote peace and common understanding. Of course, racism is never about the facts. Racism makes people see things which are not there and create problems that do not exist. The reaction to Gu is a manifestation of the ongoing importance of racial loyalty to the upkeep of the American empire. Americanism has always been synonymous with white imperial power, both in identity terms and via politics. Those who are perceived to cross the boundaries of political whiteness are traitors to the empire's civilizing mission to dominate, exploit, and plunder in the name of freedom and have crossed the line into enemy territory. I personally identify with the attacks on Eileen Gu. Growing up as a Vietnamese American of mixed race, I constantly felt my racial loyalty to the empire was being tested by peers and institutions. Most people saw me as nothing but a gook or a chink, a target of imperialist wars of past generations. The message of American society was thus clear as a young person. I could either put my head down and embrace the white American side of my family or face the threat of violence from white peers who took issues when I spoke out against their racist demagogy. When I embraced my subordinate status and linked with those of oppressed racial and national backgrounds, teachers would ask me why I would spend time with quote-unquote knuckleheads at the expense of my potential. The U.S. is a racist society. No matter how mixed race the U.S. becomes, white supremacy demands that the masses make political decisions based upon their loyalty to the American imperialist project, a racist project. Racial loyalty subsumes class contradictions in a sea of confusion and directs political energy toward the destruction of an enemy, quote unquote, other. Majority of American Westerners have been convinced that China and its people are their enemies. Eileen Gu has exposed how racial loyalty to the United States remains a prominent feature of a declining empire. Her positive message of peace and cooperation is viewed by many as an act of betrayal to our American citizenship, a euphemism for whiteness. White supremacy is inextricably bound to the Cold War 2.0 being led by the United States and its junior partners. Gu's desire for a common understanding among nations is thus unattainable unless white supremacy is confronted and thrown into the dustbin of history along with the system of imperialism that gave it birth. Thank you so much for listening to this reading of my latest published article, this time in my Substack, February 8th at chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. Please do consider signing up for an annual subscription of about $70 per year. You can also support me monthly at whatever amount, as low as $1 per month at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong to help keep this work sustainable. Thank you so much for listening again, and until next time.